Question 1. The investigation demonstrates that following a reported disturbance, responding Fort Worth Police Department officers encountered an individual exhibiting erratic behavior. During the interaction, force was used by the officers. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the responding officers and their supervisors to ensure a thorough and unbiased impact assessment of the use of force incident? Option A. Delay the formal evidence collection process until after initial debriefings with the involved officers have been completed. Option B. Immediately detain and arrest the individual based on the initial assessment of their behavior and the officer's report of the incident. Option C. Secure the scene, preserve all potential evidence including physical items and digital recordings, and initiate a comprehensive documentation process of all observations and actions taken by all involved parties. Option D. Focus on gathering statements primarily from the involved officers to corroborate their use of force before any other evidence is collected. The correct answer is C. Secure the scene, preserve all potential evidence including physical items and digital recordings, and initiate a comprehensive documentation process of all observations and actions taken by all involved parties. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates the critical need for thorough and unbiased evidence collection in a potential use of force incident. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing the immediate need to secure a scene and gather initial information with the imperative to preserve evidence that could exonerate or implicate officers. The Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, operates under Texas law and departmental policies that mandate specific procedures for handling such incidents, emphasizing objectivity and the protection of all relevant evidence. The best approach involves immediately securing the scene and initiating a comprehensive evidence collection process that includes documenting all physical evidence, witness statements, and officer accounts without premature conclusions. This aligns with FWPD policies and Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, which require meticulous documentation and preservation of evidence to ensure a fair and accurate investigation. The goal is to gather all facts objectively, allowing the subsequent review process to determine the legality and necessity of the force used. This methodical approach upholds the principles of due process and accountability. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize the immediate arrest of the individual based on initial officer statements without a thorough, independent collection of all evidence. This fails to acknowledge that initial accounts can be subjective and may not represent the complete picture. It risks violating the individual's rights and compromising the integrity of the investigation by prematurely judging guilt. Another incorrect approach is to only collect evidence that supports the officer's initial narrative, ignoring or downplaying contradictory information. This demonstrates bias and a failure to adhere to the FWPD ethical obligation to conduct a neutral and thorough investigation, potentially leading to a miscarriage of justice and departmental disciplinary action. Finally, delaying the formal evidence collection process to conduct informal interviews with officers before securing the scene can lead to contamination or loss of critical physical evidence, undermining the reliability of the investigation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with scene security and evidence preservation as the absolute first priority. This should be followed by a systematic and objective collection of all available information, including physical evidence, digital data, and statements from all parties involved. Any conclusions should be deferred until the complete evidentiary record is established and reviewed by appropriate supervisory personnel and investigators. Question 2. Assessment of the Fort Worth Police Department's approach to vehicle stops in Texas. What is the most legally sound and ethically appropriate method for an officer to conduct a search of a vehicle when they have a general suspicion but lack specific probable cause? Option A. Conduct a search based on a general feeling of suspicion that something might be in the vehicle. Option B. Inform the driver that a search is mandatory due to the nature of the stop and proceed with the search. Option C. Politely request voluntary consent from the driver to search the vehicle, clearly informing them of their right to refuse. Option D. Proceed with a search based on the driver's perceived nervousness and evasive demeanor. The correct answer is C. Politely request voluntary consent from the driver to search the vehicle, clearly informing them of their right to refuse. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an officer to balance the immediate need for information with the legal rights of an individual during an interaction. The officer must understand the nuances of when consent is required versus when a search is permissible under Texas law, and how to document these interactions accurately and ethically. Failure to do so can lead to the exclusion of evidence and disciplinary action. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and politely requesting consent to search the vehicle. This approach respects the individual's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, as protected under the U.S. Constitution and Texas law. Obtaining voluntary consent is the most straightforward and legally sound method to conduct a search when probable cause is not immediately apparent. The officer should clearly articulate the reason for the request and inform the individual that they have the right to refuse. This aligns with the principles of lawful policing and community trust. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with a search based solely on a hunch or a vague feeling of suspicion, without any articulable facts to support probable cause or reasonable suspicion. This violates the Fourth Amendment and Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, which require specific, objective reasons to detain or search an individual or their property. Another incorrect approach is to imply or coerce consent by suggesting that refusal will lead to negative consequences, or by physically blocking the individual's path to prevent them from leaving. This renders any subsequent consent involuntary and therefore invalid under the law. The interaction must be free from duress or undue pressure. A third incorrect approach is to conduct a search based on the individual's nervousness or evasive behavior alone, without any other supporting factors. While nervousness can be a component of reasonable suspicion, it is rarely sufficient on its own to justify a search, especially in Texas, where citizens have a right to be nervous when interacting with law enforcement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes constitutional rights and legal statutes. This involves 1. Assessing the situation for articulable facts that establish reasonable suspicion or probable cause. 2. If grounds are insufficient for a warrantless search, clearly and politely requesting voluntary consent, informing the individual of their right to refuse. 3. Documenting the entire interaction, including the request for consent and the individual's response, meticulously. And 4. Understanding that consent must be freely and voluntarily given, not coerced or implied. Question 3. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a body camera program for the Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, could offer significant advantages in terms of evidence collection and officer accountability. Considering the multifaceted nature of such an initiative, which approach best ensures the responsible and effective integration of this technology within the FWPD operations and community engagement? Option A. Prioritize the lowest initial purchase price for body cameras, assuming that the primary cost is the hardware itself. Option B. Focus exclusively on the potential for increased officer accountability without detailed planning for data storage, privacy, or evidence handling protocols. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment evaluating operational, training, data management, legal, and community relations implications alongside financial costs and benefits. Option D. Adopt a body camera system based on what is currently being used by a neighboring police department, without an independent evaluation of its suitability for Fort Worth. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment evaluating operational, training, data management, legal, and community relations implications alongside financial costs and benefits. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for public safety with the potential long-term consequences of resource allocation decisions. The Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, must consider not only the direct costs of implementing a new technology, but also its indirect impacts on operational efficiency, personnel training, and community relations. A hasty decision without thorough impact assessment could lead to wasted resources, decreased effectiveness, or even negative public perception, all of which are critical concerns for a law enforcement agency. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves conducting a comprehensive impact assessment that systematically evaluates the potential benefits and drawbacks of the proposed body camera program across multiple dimensions. This approach prioritizes understanding how the technology will affect operational procedures, officer training requirements, data storage and management, legal compliance, and community trust. By thoroughly analyzing these factors, the FWPD can make an informed decision that maximizes the positive outcomes while mitigating potential risks. This aligns with principles of responsible governance and efficient resource management, ensuring that public funds are used effectively to enhance public safety and accountability. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to focus solely on the initial purchase price of the body cameras, neglecting other significant costs and benefits. This narrow focus fails to account for ongoing expenses such as data storage, maintenance, software upgrades, and the substantial investment in officer training and policy development. Ethically, this approach is flawed as it prioritizes short-term cost savings over long-term effectiveness and the potential for improved transparency and accountability, which are crucial for community relations. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the perceived immediate increase in officer accountability without considering the practical implications for evidence management and potential for misuse. While accountability is a key benefit, failing to establish robust protocols for data handling, privacy, and access can lead to legal challenges, erode public trust, and create an administrative burden that outweighs the intended benefits. This approach overlooks the importance of a holistic strategy that integrates technology with policy and training. A third incorrect approach is to adopt the technology based on anecdotal evidence or the practices of other departments without conducting an independent assessment tailored to the specific needs and context of Fort Worth. While learning from others is valuable, each department has unique operational challenges, community demographics, and existing infrastructure. Ignoring this specificity can lead to a misapplication of resources and a failure to achieve the desired outcomes, potentially resulting in a program that is inefficient or even counterproductive. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the problem or opportunity. This is followed by identifying and evaluating all relevant stakeholders and their interests. Next, a comprehensive analysis of potential solutions, including their impacts and feasibility, is conducted. This assessment should be evidence-based and consider both quantitative and qualitative factors. Finally, a decision is made based on the comprehensive analysis, with a plan for implementation, monitoring, and evaluation to ensure the chosen course of action achieves its intended objectives and remains adaptable to changing circumstances. Question 4. Regulatory review indicates that Fort Worth Police Department officers are tasked with responding to situations where suspicious activity may be occurring. Considering the principles of risk assessment and constitutional law as applied in Texas, which of the following represents the most appropriate initial course of action for an officer observing individuals loitering near a closed business with furtive movements? Option A. Initiate a full pat-down search of each individual for weapons based on the observed furtive movements. Option B. Approach the individuals, identify yourself as a police officer, and politely inquire about their presence and purpose, observing their demeanor and responses. Option C. Continue to observe from a distance without any interaction, assuming the situation will resolve itself without intervention. Option D. Immediately demand identification from each individual and ask them to empty their pockets to ensure they are not carrying contraband. Correct answer is B. Approach the individuals, identify yourself as a police officer, and politely inquire about their presence and purpose, observing their demeanor and responses. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for law enforcement officers in Fort Worth, Texas, involving the potential for a crime to occur based on observed behavior. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need to prevent crime and ensure public safety with the constitutional rights of individuals, specifically the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Officers must make rapid judgments based on incomplete information, requiring a nuanced understanding of probable cause and reasonable suspicion. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a phased approach to risk assessment, beginning with observation and escalating only as suspicion solidifies. This approach prioritizes gathering objective facts to establish reasonable suspicion before any intrusive action is taken. In this case, the initial observation of individuals loitering near a closed business with no apparent legitimate reason, coupled with furtive movements, would justify a brief, non-intrusive interaction to ascertain their purpose. This interaction, if conducted professionally and respectfully, aims to gather information to either dispel or confirm suspicion. If the individuals provide a satisfactory explanation and their behavior is consistent with that explanation, the encounter should end. This aligns with Texas law and Fourth Amendment principles, which permit brief investigatory stops based on reasonable suspicion, but do not allow for prolonged detention or search without further justification. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately demanding identification and questioning the individuals about their activities without any prior observation of criminal activity or a direct threat. This constitutes an unreasonable seizure under the Fourth Amendment and Texas law, as it lacks the necessary reasonable suspicion to justify the intrusion. Officers cannot detain individuals solely based on their presence in a particular area or their perceived nervousness. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the situation entirely, despite the suspicious circumstances. While officers must respect individual rights, they also have a duty to investigate potential criminal activity. Failing to investigate suspicious behavior that could indicate an impending crime, such as burglary or vandalism, would be a dereliction of duty and could compromise public safety. A third incorrect approach is to immediately attempt to search the individuals or their belongings based solely on the initial observations. This is a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, as a search requires probable cause, or, at a minimum, reasonable suspicion coupled with specific articulable facts that the person is armed and dangerous, which is not established by the initial scenario. Professional reasoning. Law enforcement professionals in Fort Worth should employ a graduated response to suspicious circumstances. This involves 1. Objective observation, carefully noting all observable facts and behaviors. 2. Articulation of suspicion, determining if the observed facts rise to the level of reasonable suspicion, which is more than a hunch but less than probable cause. 3. Limited intrusion, if reasonable suspicion exists, engaging in a brief, non-intrusive interaction to confirm or dispel suspicion. 4. Escalation, if warranted. Only if the interaction reveals further evidence of criminal activity or danger should the officer consider more intrusive measures, always guided by legal standards for probable cause or specific exceptions. This systematic approach ensures constitutional rights are protected while fulfilling the duty to maintain public order. Question 5. Consider a scenario where a Fort Worth Police Department (FWPD) officer arrives at a reported disturbance and observes an individual matching a general description of a suspect fleeing the immediate vicinity of a crime scene. The individual appears agitated but not overtly threatening. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the officer to take regarding this individual? Option A. Secure the scene, ensure public safety, and then contact supervisors and detectives to coordinate further actions regarding the individual. Option B. Detain the individual indefinitely based on their proximity to the scene and suspicious demeanor until further investigation can occur. Option C. Immediately detain and extensively question the individual about their involvement in the crime to gather immediate intelligence. Option D. Ignore the individual and focus solely on securing the perimeter of the crime scene, assuming they are unrelated. Correct answer is A. Secure the scene, ensure public safety, and then contact supervisors and detectives to coordinate further actions regarding the individual. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an officer to balance the immediate need for information with the potential for compromising an ongoing investigation and violating an individual's rights. The officer must make a rapid assessment of risk, considering the potential for harm, the urgency of the situation, and the legal boundaries of their authority. The pressure of a potentially dangerous situation can lead to hasty decisions that may have significant legal and ethical repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves prioritizing the immediate safety of the public and officers, while simultaneously initiating a process that respects legal procedures and preserves the integrity of the investigation. This means securing the scene, rendering aid if necessary, and then contacting supervisors and detectives to ensure proper protocols are followed for interviewing potential witnesses or suspects. This approach aligns with the Fort Worth Police Department's (FWPD) commitment to lawful and ethical policing, emphasizing the importance of evidence preservation and due process. By involving supervisors and detectives, the officer ensures that any subsequent action, such as questioning, are conducted within legal parameters and do not jeopardize the investigation. This adheres to the principles of investigative integrity and the rights of individuals. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately question the individual extensively about the crime without proper authorization or consideration for their rights. This could lead to the individual providing unreliable information under duress, or worse, the information being inadmissible in court due to procedural violations. It also risks tipping off the individual or other involved parties, compromising the investigation. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the individual entirely and focus solely on securing the scene, without any attempt to gather potentially crucial information or assess their role. While scene security is paramount, a potentially cooperative witness or even a suspect might possess vital details that could aid in apprehension or understanding the event, and failing to engage appropriately could be a missed opportunity. A third incorrect approach is to detain the individual indefinitely without clear justification or legal basis, solely based on their presence at the scene. This could lead to an unlawful detention, violating the individual's civil liberties and creating legal liabilities for the department. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, legality, and investigative integrity. This involves a rapid assessment of the situation, identifying immediate threats, and then consulting established protocols and supervisors. The officer should always consider the potential legal and ethical ramifications of their actions, ensuring that their decisions are justifiable and align with departmental policies and the law. In situations involving potential criminal activity, the immediate priority is to secure the scene and ensure safety, followed by a systematic approach to information gathering that respects individual rights and preserves evidence. Question 6. Upon reviewing a suspicious vehicle parked for an extended period in a high-crime area of Fort Worth, Texas, officers observe an individual inside the vehicle quickly place a small, dark object into a nearby storm drain before exiting the vehicle and walking away. What is the most appropriate risk assessment and subsequent action for the Fort Worth Police Department officers in this situation? Option A. Ignore the object placed in the storm drain and focus solely on apprehending the individual, as the object may be insignificant. Option B. Enter the individual's residence without a warrant based on the assumption that the object was evidence of a crime. Option C. Wait for a supervisor to arrive and assess the situation before taking any action regarding the storm drain or the individual. Option D. Immediately secure the storm drain to preserve potential evidence, and then attempt to locate and detain the individual for questioning, while preparing to seek a warrant if probable cause develops. The correct answer is D. Immediately secure the storm drain to preserve potential evidence, and then attempt to locate and detain the individual for questioning, while preparing to seek a warrant if probable cause develops. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in law enforcement, balancing the need for swift action with the requirement for thorough and lawful evidence gathering. The Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, operates under Texas state law and federal constitutional principles, particularly the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The challenge lies in assessing the risk of evidence destruction or suspect escape without compromising constitutional rights or departmental policy. The correct approach involves a systematic risk assessment that prioritizes immediate safety and evidence preservation, while adhering to legal protocols. This means officers must quickly evaluate the totality of circumstances, considering factors like the nature of the suspected crime, the presence of weapons, the number of individuals involved, and the potential for escape or evidence tampering. If a clear and present danger exists that necessitates immediate entry to prevent harm or destruction of evidence, officers may be justified in entering without a warrant under established exceptions like exigent circumstances. However, this decision must be based on articulable facts and a reasonable belief, not mere suspicion. The FWPD internal policies, aligned with Texas law and constitutional mandates, would guide officers in documenting these circumstances thoroughly and seeking a warrant as soon as practicable if the initial entry was based on exigent circumstances that later subside. An incorrect approach would be to enter a residence based solely on a hunch or a general concern about potential evidence destruction, without specific, articulable facts supporting such a belief. This could violate the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, leading to the suppression of any evidence found. Another incorrect approach is to delay entry for an extended period to secure a warrant when there is a clear and imminent risk of evidence destruction or suspect escape. This inaction could result in the loss of critical evidence or the apprehension of a dangerous individual. Finally, entering a residence without any attempt to articulate the specific circumstances justifying the entry, even if evidence is ultimately found, demonstrates a failure to follow proper procedure and a disregard for constitutional protections. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with an immediate assessment of the scene for safety threats. If safety is not an immediate concern, officers should then evaluate the risk of evidence destruction or suspect escape based on concrete observations. This assessment should be documented contemporaneously. If exigent circumstances are present, officers may proceed with entry, ensuring the scope of the entry is limited to what is necessary to address the exigency. If exigent circumstances are not present, officers should secure the scene and seek a warrant. Throughout this process, adherence to departmental policy and legal precedent is paramount. Question 7. When evaluating a potential burglary scene in Fort Worth, Texas, where a resident reports seeing an individual fleeing the property, what is the most prudent initial course of action for a responding Fort Worth Police Department officer? Option A. Secure the scene to preserve potential evidence, and then attempt to locate and detain the fleeing individual based on reasonable suspicion, advising them of their rights if a custodial interrogation is anticipated. Option B. Detain the fleeing individual based on the resident's report alone, without further assessment of the situation. Option C. Immediately approach and question the fleeing individual to gather their account of events before securing the scene. Option D. Focus solely on canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses to gather as many accounts as possible before addressing the fleeing individual or the scene. Correct answer is A. Secure the scene to preserve potential evidence, and then attempt to locate and detain the fleeing individual based on reasonable suspicion, advising them of their rights if a custodial interrogation is anticipated. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an officer to balance the immediate need for information with the potential for that information to be tainted or inadmissible if obtained improperly. The officer must consider the legal rights of the individual and the procedural safeguards in place to ensure fair investigation. The pressure of a potential crime and the desire to quickly gather evidence can lead to hasty decisions that compromise the integrity of the investigation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves prioritizing the establishment of probable cause and securing the scene before attempting to question the individual. This approach ensures that any subsequent statements or evidence obtained are legally sound and admissible. In Texas, as per the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, officers must have probable cause to arrest and must advise individuals of their rights, e.g., Miranda warnings if in custody before custodial interrogation. Securing the scene prevents contamination of evidence and allows for a systematic approach to information gathering. This aligns with the ethical duty to uphold the law and due process. Incorrect approaches analysis. Questioning the individual immediately without establishing probable cause or securing the scene risks violating the individual's rights. If the individual is not free to leave and is questioned without Miranda warnings, any statements made could be deemed involuntary and inadmissible in court, hindering the investigation. This fails to adhere to the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure regarding custodial interrogation. Focusing solely on gathering witness statements without securing the scene or addressing the potential suspect could lead to the loss or contamination of crucial physical evidence. This neglects the fundamental investigative principle of preserving the integrity of the crime scene, which is paramount in building a strong case. Attempting to detain the individual based on a hunch without sufficient articulable facts to form reasonable suspicion or probable cause would constitute an unlawful stop or arrest. This violates the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Texas law, which require specific legal grounds for detention. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic approach to risk assessment in law enforcement. This involves 1. Scene assessment. Immediately evaluate the safety of the scene and the need to secure it. 2. Legal thresholds. Determine the legal basis for any interaction, e.g., reasonable suspicion for a stop, probable cause for an arrest. 3. Rights advisement. If an individual is in custody and subject to interrogation, ensure Miranda warnings are given. 4. Evidence preservation. Prioritize the collection and preservation of all relevant evidence. 5. Information gathering. Conduct interviews and gather statements in a manner that respects legal and ethical boundaries. Question 8. The analysis reveals that a Fort Worth Police Department officer receives a dispatch call reporting an individual acting strangely near a public park entrance in Fort Worth, Texas. The caller provides no further details about the individual's behavior or appearance. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the officer to take to assess the situation in compliance with Texas law and departmental guidelines? Option A. Ignore the dispatch call as the information is too vague to warrant police intervention. Option B. Immediately approach the individual and ask them to explain their behavior based on the vague report. Option C. Contact the reporting party for more specific details about what made the individual appear to be acting strangely. Option D. Proceed to the location and observe the individual from a distance to gather specific details about their behavior that might indicate public intoxication before making any contact. The correct answer is D. Proceed to the location and observe the individual from a distance to gather specific details about their behavior that might indicate public intoxication before making any contact. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where a Fort Worth Police Department (FWPD) officer is presented with information suggesting a potential violation of Texas state law regarding public intoxication, but the information is vague and lacks concrete evidence. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires the officer to balance the duty to investigate potential criminal activity with the need to avoid unwarranted stops or accusations based on insufficient grounds. The officer must exercise sound judgment to uphold the law while respecting individual liberties. The best approach involves gathering additional, specific information to establish reasonable suspicion before initiating any investigative action. This means seeking details that directly link an individual to observable signs of intoxication that would constitute a violation of Texas Penal Code Section 49.02, public intoxication. This approach is correct because it aligns with the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, which requires law enforcement to have at least reasonable suspicion of criminal activity before detaining an individual. By seeking more specific details, the officer ensures that any subsequent action is based on articulable facts, not mere conjecture or generalized suspicion, thereby adhering to both legal standards and ethical policing principles. An incorrect approach would be to immediately confront the individual based solely on the vague report of acting strangely. This fails to establish reasonable suspicion, as acting strangely is subjective and can encompass many non-criminal behaviors. Such an action could lead to an unlawful detention, violating an individual's rights and potentially exposing the department to civil liability. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the report entirely without any attempt to gather further information. While the initial report may be weak, a complete disregard for potential public safety concerns could be seen as a dereliction of duty. Officers have a responsibility to investigate credible, albeit initially vague, information that could indicate a violation of law. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely on stereotypes or assumptions about the individual's appearance or demeanor to justify a stop. This is ethically unsound and legally impermissible, as it constitutes discriminatory profiling rather than objective assessment of behavior against legal standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes the acquisition of specific, articulable facts to establish reasonable suspicion. This involves asking clarifying questions of the reporting party, observing the individual from a distance if possible to note specific behaviors, and considering the totality of the circumstances before deciding on the next course of action. The goal is to ensure that any intervention is lawful, justified, and serves the public interest without infringing on individual rights. Question 9. The audit findings indicate a pattern of delayed and incomplete investigations into citizen complaints alleging excessive force within the Fort Worth Police Department. Which of the following represents the most appropriate risk assessment and investigative approach in such a scenario, adhering to Texas law and departmental policy? Option A. Immediately initiate a formal internal affairs investigation, meticulously gathering all available evidence, including witness statements and footage, to objectively assess the reasonableness of the force used, in accordance with FWPD policy and Texas statutes governing peace officer conduct. Option B. Dismiss the complaint if the complainant has a history of prior complaints or disciplinary actions, as this may indicate a pattern of unsubstantiated allegations. Option C. Accept the officer's written report of the incident as sufficient evidence, unless there is clear and compelling evidence of falsification, to expedite the resolution of the complaint. Option D. Place the officer on administrative leave with pay immediately upon receipt of the complaint, regardless of the initial evidence, to demonstrate the department's commitment to addressing such issues. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate a formal internal affairs investigation, meticulously gathering all available evidence, including witness statements and footage, to objectively assess the reasonableness of the force used, in accordance with FWPD policy and Texas statutes governing peace officer conduct. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential breakdown in the Fort Worth Police Department's FWPD adherence to risk assessment protocols, specifically concerning the handling of citizen complaints that involve allegations of excessive force. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for thorough investigation, due process for officers, and public trust, all while operating within the strict legal and ethical framework governing law enforcement in Texas. Missteps can lead to internal discipline issues, civil litigation, and significant damage to the department's reputation. The best approach involves a systematic and documented risk assessment process that prioritizes objectivity and fairness. This means immediately initiating a formal internal affairs investigation upon receiving a credible complaint of excessive force. This investigation must be conducted by trained personnel, adhering to FWPD policy and Texas law regarding peace officer conduct and disciplinary procedures. The assessment should focus on gathering all relevant evidence, including witness statements, body-worn camera footage, and use of force reports, to determine if the force used was objectively reasonable under the circumstances, as defined by legal precedent. This methodical approach ensures accountability, protects the rights of both the complainant and the officer, and upholds the department's commitment to lawful and ethical policing. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the complaint based on the complainant's prior disciplinary record, without a thorough investigation. This fails to acknowledge that all allegations, regardless of the complainant's background, warrant impartial review, risks overlooking potential misconduct, and erodes public confidence, as it suggests a bias against certain individuals. Ethically, it violates the principle of treating all complaints with seriousness and due diligence. Another incorrect approach is to immediately suspend the officer involved pending the outcome of an investigation, without a preliminary assessment of the evidence. While swift action might seem decisive, it can be premature and potentially unfair to the officer if the initial complaint lacks sufficient credible evidence to warrant such a severe immediate consequence. This can lead to legal challenges regarding due process and may negatively impact officer morale without proper justification. Finally, an incorrect approach is to rely solely on the officer's self-reporting of the incident without independent corroboration or review of available evidence. This bypasses crucial investigative steps and fails to provide an objective assessment of the situation, creates a significant risk of overlooking critical details or evidence that might contradict the officer's account, thereby compromising the integrity of the investigation and potentially shielding misconduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with acknowledging the complaint and its potential severity. This is followed by an immediate activation of established investigative protocols, ensuring all evidence is collected and analyzed objectively. The process should be transparent to the extent legally permissible, and decisions regarding disciplinary action must be based on the findings of a thorough and impartial investigation, aligned with FWPD policies and Texas statutes. Question 10. Implementation of the Fort Worth Police Department's overtime compensation policy requires accurate calculation of an officer's weekly earnings. If Officer Miller worked 45 hours in a week, and his regular hourly rate is $25, and the FWPD policy dictates overtime pay at 1.5 times the regular rate for all hours worked over 40 in a week, what would be Officer Miller's total gross pay for that week? Adhering strictly to these parameters. Option A, $1,125.00. Option B, $1,000.00. Option C, $1,250.00. Option D, $1,187.50. The correct answer is D, $1,187.50. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for law enforcement officers in Fort Worth, Texas, involving the accurate calculation of overtime pay based on departmental policy and state labor laws. Misinterpreting or misapplying these regulations can lead to significant financial discrepancies, employee dissatisfaction, and potential legal challenges against the Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD. The professional challenge lies in ensuring fairness and compliance while managing departmental resources effectively. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously applying the FWPD established overtime calculation policy, which aligns with Texas labor laws regarding overtime compensation. This approach requires understanding that overtime is typically paid at 1.5 times the regular hourly rate for hours worked beyond a standard workweek. For Officer Miller, who worked 45 hours in a week with a regular rate of $25 per hour, the calculation would be regular pay for 40 hours, /40 text hours times $25 text hour equals $1,000 overtime hours, /45 text hours 40 text hours equals 5 text hours overtime rate, $25 text hour times 1.5 equals $37.50 text hour overtime pay, /5 text hours times $37.50 text hour equals $187.50 total pay for the week, $1,000 plus $187.50 equals $1,187.50 . This method ensures accurate compensation for all hours worked, adhering to both departmental policy and the principles of fair labor practices as outlined by Texas statutes. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply pay Officer Miller for all 45 hours at his regular rate of $25 per hour. This fails to account for the overtime premium mandated by both FWPD policy and Texas labor law, resulting in underpayment. This approach disregards the legal requirement for premium pay for hours exceeding the standard workweek. Another incorrect approach would be to calculate overtime at double the regular rate for all hours worked beyond 40. While some specific circumstances might warrant higher overtime rates, the standard FWPD policy, in alignment with Texas law, dictates a 1.5 times rate for typical overtime. Applying a double rate without specific authorization or policy basis would lead to overpayment and misallocation of departmental funds. A further incorrect approach would be to exclude the 5 hours of overtime from the calculation altogether, paying Officer Miller only for his regular 40 hours. This is a direct violation of FWPD policy and Texas labor laws, which mandate compensation for all hours worked, including overtime, at the appropriate rate. This approach demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of wage and hour regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach overtime calculations by first consulting the most current and specific departmental policy regarding compensation. This policy should then be cross-referenced with applicable state labor laws, in this case, Texas statutes governing overtime. A systematic approach involving clear identification of regular hours, overtime hours, regular rate, and overtime rate, followed by precise mathematical calculation, is essential. When in doubt, seeking clarification from a supervisor or the Human Resources Department is a critical step in ensuring accuracy and compliance. Question 11. To address the challenge of maintaining public safety while respecting individual liberties during a routine traffic stop in Fort Worth, Texas, an officer observes a driver exhibiting nervous behavior, including fidgeting and avoiding direct eye contact. The driver is stopped for a minor traffic violation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the officer? Option A. Complete the traffic citation for the observed violation. Remain observant of the driver's behavior and take no further action unless new, articulable facts arise that justify expanding the stop. Option B. Immediately call for backup and begin a more intrusive investigation into potential drug activity due to the driver's perceived evasiveness. Option C. Order the driver out of the vehicle and question them about unrelated suspicious activity without any specific factual basis. Option D. Initiate a pat-down search of the driver for weapons based on their nervous demeanor and evasive eye contact. The correct answer is A. Complete the traffic citation for the observed violation, remain observant of the driver's behavior, and take no further action unless new, articulable facts arise that justify expanding the stop. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Fort Worth Police Department FWPD officer because it involves a potential violation of an individual's civil liberties during a lawful stop. The officer must balance the need for public safety and adherence to departmental policy with the constitutional rights of the individual. Misjudging the situation could lead to a wrongful arrest, a lawsuit against the department, and damage to community trust. Careful judgment is required to determine if the observed behavior constitutes probable cause for further action beyond the initial traffic infraction. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalating the situation and focusing on the initial reason for the stop while remaining observant. This approach prioritizes constitutional rights and departmental procedure. Specifically, the officer should complete the traffic citation process for the observed violation, while remaining aware of the individual's demeanor and any potential indicators of further criminal activity. The officer should not initiate a new investigation or detention based solely on a subjective feeling or a vague observation that does not rise to the level of reasonable suspicion or probable cause for a separate offense. This aligns with the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and FWPD policy that requires specific justification for expanding an encounter beyond its initial lawful purpose. Incorrect approaches analysis. Initiating a pat-down search for weapons based on the driver's nervous demeanor and evasive eye contact is an incorrect approach. Nervousness alone does not constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or a threat to officer safety. This action would likely violate the Fourth Amendment, as it lacks the necessary justification for a search beyond the scope of the initial traffic stop. Demanding the driver exit the vehicle and questioning them about unrelated suspicious activity without any articulable facts to support such suspicion is also an incorrect approach. This expands the scope of the stop beyond the original traffic violation without sufficient legal grounds, infringing upon the driver's rights and potentially constituting an unlawful detention. Immediately calling for backup and initiating a more intrusive investigation into potential drug activity based on the driver's perceived evasiveness is an incorrect approach. While officer safety is paramount, this action is premature and lacks the specific, objective facts required to escalate the situation beyond a routine traffic stop. It bypasses the established legal thresholds for expanding an investigation and could be seen as harassment. Professional reasoning. Professionals in law enforcement should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly identifying the lawful basis for any interaction with an individual. This includes understanding the specific infraction or observed behavior that initiated the stop. The framework then requires assessing whether any new, articulable facts emerge during the interaction that create reasonable suspicion of other criminal activity or probable cause for arrest. Throughout the encounter, officers must continuously evaluate their actions against constitutional protections and departmental policies, prioritizing de-escalation and minimizing intrusion unless legally justified. Question 12. Examination of the data shows that upon arriving at a reported burglary in progress at a residence in Fort Worth, Texas, officers observe signs of forced entry and hear movement inside. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the responding Fort Worth Police Department officers? Option A. Leave the immediate vicinity to attempt to locate a potential witness seen running from the area, assuming the scene is secure enough to return to later. Option B. Make a brief note of the observations and proceed to the next call for service, assuming the suspect has already fled. Option C. Secure the perimeter of the residence, establish a perimeter, and immediately notify a supervisor and the appropriate investigative unit to request their presence and guidance. Option D. Immediately enter the residence to search for the suspect, prioritizing apprehension over scene preservation. The correct answer is C. Secure the perimeter of the residence, establish a perimeter, and immediately notify a supervisor and the appropriate investigative unit to request their presence and guidance. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for law enforcement officers in Fort Worth, Texas. balancing the need for immediate action with the requirement for proper legal procedure and evidence preservation. The professional challenge lies in the potential for a lapse in judgment under pressure, which could compromise an investigation, violate an individual's rights, or lead to inadmissible evidence in court. Careful consideration of departmental policy, Texas law, and constitutional principles is paramount. The best professional practice involves securing the scene and immediately contacting a supervisor and the appropriate investigative unit. This approach ensures that the scene is preserved in its original state, preventing contamination or loss of evidence. It also leverages the expertise of specialized units and allows for proper authorization and documentation of any further actions, such as a search. This aligns with Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, general orders regarding evidence handling and crime scene integrity, as well as Texas Code of Criminal Procedure and the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which protect against unreasonable searches and seizures. An approach that involves immediately entering the residence to search for the suspect without further authorization or securing the scene first is professionally unacceptable. This action risks contaminating or destroying crucial evidence, potentially violating the suspect's Fourth Amendment rights if probable cause for a warrantless entry is not clearly established and exigent circumstances do not exist. It bypasses established departmental procedures for handling sensitive crime scenes and evidence. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to leave the scene unattended to pursue a potential witness without first securing the immediate area. While apprehending a witness might seem important, abandoning a potential crime scene without proper safeguarding could lead to the loss or alteration of critical evidence, thereby hindering the investigation. This neglects the primary duty to preserve the integrity of the crime scene. Finally, an approach that involves only making a brief note of the situation and leaving the scene without taking any immediate action to secure it or notify supervisors is also professionally deficient. This demonstrates a failure to recognize the importance of crime scene preservation and the need for proper investigative protocols. It could result in the loss of valuable evidence and a failure to initiate a timely and thorough investigation, potentially violating FWPD policy and investigative best practices. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes scene integrity, adherence to departmental policy and legal statutes, and clear communication with supervisors and specialized units. This involves a systematic assessment of the situation, identifying immediate risks to evidence and public safety, and then acting in accordance with established protocols to mitigate those risks, while ensuring all actions are legally sound and ethically justifiable. Question 13. Research into Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, protocols and Texas law regarding warrantless searches. Consider a scenario where officers receive a tip about potential drug activity at a residence. The tip is from a confidential informant whose reliability is unknown, and the officers observe no overt signs of illegal activity or immediate danger upon arrival. Which of the following actions best adheres to the legal and ethical standards for the FWPD? Option A. Immediately enter the residence to prevent potential destruction of evidence, given the nature of drug activity. Option B. Secure a perimeter around the residence and attempt to obtain a search warrant based on the informant's tip and their observations, while remaining vigilant for any signs of imminent danger or evidence destruction. Option C. Rely solely on the confidential informant's tip and enter the residence to conduct a search. Option D. Knock on the door and if no one answers, force entry to investigate the tip further. The correct answer is B. Secure a perimeter around the residence and attempt to obtain a search warrant based on the informant's tip and their observations, while remaining vigilant for any signs of imminent danger or evidence destruction. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for law enforcement officers in Fort Worth, Texas, balancing the need for immediate action with the requirement for thorough and lawful evidence collection. The professional challenge lies in the potential for exigent circumstances to justify a warrantless entry, but also the strict legal boundaries that define when such circumstances truly exist. Misjudging this balance can lead to the suppression of crucial evidence, jeopardizing a prosecution and undermining public trust. The Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, operates under the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, as interpreted by Texas state law and relevant case law, which protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. The best professional practice involves a meticulous assessment of the totality of the circumstances to determine if probable cause exists and if exigent circumstances genuinely necessitate immediate entry without a warrant. This approach prioritizes constitutional rights while acknowledging the practical realities of police work. Specifically, it requires officers to articulate specific, observable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that evidence is in danger of imminent destruction or that a person within the premises is in immediate danger of serious bodily harm. This aligns with the legal standard for exceptions to the warrant requirement, ensuring that any intrusion is both necessary and justified. An incorrect approach would be to assume exigent circumstances based on generalized suspicion or the mere possibility of evidence destruction. For instance, entering a residence solely because a suspect is believed to be inside and might destroy evidence without concrete indicators of imminent destruction violates the Fourth Amendment. Similarly, relying on a neighbor's vague report of a disturbance without further corroboration or specific details about immediate danger fails to meet the threshold for exigent circumstances. These approaches disregard the constitutional requirement for probable cause and a demonstrable immediate threat, leading to unlawful searches and potential evidence suppression. Professional decision-making in such situations requires officers to engage in a structured thought process. This includes 1. Identifying the observed facts, 2. Assessing whether these facts establish probable cause to believe a crime has occurred or is occurring. 3. Evaluating if there is a genuine, imminent threat of evidence destruction or harm to a person. And 4. Considering whether less intrusive means are available. If exigent circumstances are present, officers must then document their specific observations and the rationale for their warrantless entry meticulously. Question 14. Which approach would be most consistent with Fort Worth Police Department (FWPD) best practices when encountering an individual exhibiting agitated behavior in a public park, but not posing an immediate overt threat? Option A. Immediately attempt to physically restrain the individual to prevent any potential escalation. Option B. Attempt to verbally de-escalate the situation by clearly communicating commands and intentions, while assessing the immediate threat level and observing the individual's behavior for compliance or escalation. Option C. Engage in aggressive questioning and demand identification without a clear legal basis. Option D. Disregard the individual's behavior and continue on patrol, assuming it is not a direct concern. The correct answer is B. Attempt to verbally de-escalate the situation by clearly communicating commands and intentions, while assessing the immediate threat level and observing the individual's behavior for compliance or escalation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge common in law enforcement, particularly within the Fort Worth Police Department (FWPD). Officers are often faced with situations requiring immediate action and judgment calls that have significant legal and ethical ramifications. The challenge lies in balancing the need for swift intervention with the imperative to uphold constitutional rights and departmental policy. Misjudgments can lead to legal repercussions, disciplinary action, and erosion of public trust. Careful consideration of established protocols and legal precedents is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice in this situation involves a measured and legally sound approach that prioritizes de-escalation and adherence to established procedures. This approach would involve attempting to verbally de-escalate the situation by clearly communicating commands and explaining the officer's intentions, while simultaneously assessing the immediate threat level and observing the individual's behavior for any signs of compliance or escalation. This aligns with FWPD training on use of force continuum and de-escalation techniques, emphasizing that force should only be used when necessary and proportionate to the threat. The goal is to resolve the situation with minimal force and without infringing upon the individual's rights, as mandated by the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution regarding unreasonable searches and seizures. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately resort to physical restraint or force without attempting verbal de-escalation or a thorough assessment of the threat. This fails to adhere to the FWPD use of force policy, which requires officers to exhaust all reasonable de-escalation options before employing physical force. Such an action could be deemed excessive force, violating the individual's constitutional rights and leading to civil liability and disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation and leave the premises without taking any action, even if the individual appears distressed or is potentially engaging in behavior that could lead to harm or a disturbance. This would be a dereliction of duty and a failure to uphold the FWPD mandate to protect and serve the community. It could also violate departmental policies regarding responding to calls for service or observed suspicious activity. A third incorrect approach would be to engage in overly aggressive questioning or intimidation tactics that are not directly related to the immediate situation or the individual's behavior. This could be construed as harassment or a violation of the individual's right to remain silent and not be subjected to unreasonable interrogation, potentially creating a hostile encounter and undermining the officer's credibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the immediate circumstances and the potential risks involved. This framework should then integrate knowledge of relevant laws, such as the Fourth Amendment, departmental policies, like the use of force continuum and de-escalation protocols, and ethical considerations. The process involves continuous assessment, communication, and a commitment to resolving the situation in a manner that is both effective and lawful, prioritizing the safety of all parties involved and upholding the integrity of the department. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a Fort Worth Police Department officer has lawfully stopped a vehicle for a minor traffic violation. The officer has no articulable suspicion of criminal activity beyond the initial infraction. During the interaction, the officer wishes to search the vehicle for contraband. What is the most appropriate course of action for the officer to take in Fort Worth, Texas, to ensure legal compliance and uphold individual rights? Option A. Request consent to search the vehicle without mentioning the driver's right to refuse. Option B. Clearly inform the driver that they have the right to refuse consent to a search of their vehicle before asking for permission to search. Option C. Ask the driver if they mind if the officer looks in the car, assuming a lack of immediate objection implies consent. Option D. Proceed with a visual inspection of the vehicle's interior, based on the officer's intuition that something might be amiss. Correct answer is B. Clearly inform the driver that they have the right to refuse consent to a search of their vehicle before asking for permission to search. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Fort Worth Police Department officers, balancing the immediate need for information with the legal and ethical obligations to protect individual rights during an investigation. The officer must make a rapid judgment call that could significantly impact the case and the rights of the individual involved, requiring a deep understanding of Texas law and departmental policy regarding consent and search. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly informing the individual of their right to refuse consent before requesting permission to search their vehicle. This approach respects the individual's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, as guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and interpreted by Texas courts. Obtaining voluntary and informed consent is paramount. By explicitly stating that the individual does not have to consent and can refuse the search, the officer ensures that any consent given is truly voluntary and not coerced, thereby making any evidence found admissible in court and upholding departmental integrity. Incorrect approach is analysis. Requesting consent to search without first informing the individual of their right to refuse is problematic. This can be construed as an attempt to obtain consent under potentially coercive circumstances, even if not overtly threatening. The individual might feel pressured to comply, believing they have no alternative, which would render the consent involuntary and any evidence obtained inadmissible. This violates the principles of due process and the protection against unreasonable searches. Proceeding with a search based on a perceived lack of objection, without explicit verbal consent, is also unacceptable. Silence or a passive demeanor cannot be interpreted as consent to a search. Law enforcement officers must obtain affirmative consent. Relying on assumptions undermines the requirement for voluntary consent and infringes upon individual liberties. Immediately initiating a search based on a hunch or suspicion, without seeking consent or establishing probable cause for a warrantless search, is a direct violation of Fourth Amendment protections. This action bypasses legal requirements for searches and seizures, potentially leading to the suppression of evidence and disciplinary action against the officer. Professional reasoning. Officers should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes constitutional rights and departmental policy. This involves 1. Assessing the situation for articulable suspicion or probable cause. 2. If neither exists, clearly and unequivocally informing the individual of their right to refuse consent before requesting permission to search. 3. Obtaining affirmative, voluntary consent. And 4. Documenting the interaction thoroughly, including the consent process. If consent is refused or not obtained, officers must respect that decision and continue their investigation through lawful means. Question 16. System analysis indicates a Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD officer, while on routine patrol in Tarrant County, Texas, observes an individual discarding a small, suspicious package into a public trash receptacle. The officer approaches the individual and, upon further observation, believes the package may contain illegal narcotics, a potential felony offense. What is the most appropriate and professionally sound course of action for the officer to take regarding the discarded package? Option A. Dispose of the suspected contraband immediately, believing it to be minor. Option B. Leave the evidence unsecured at the scene while the officer continues their patrol duties. Option C. Secure the scene and immediately notify a supervisor and the appropriate investigative unit to handle the evidence collection. Option D. Collect the suspected contraband themselves and place it in their patrol car's evidence locker without further consultation. The correct answer is C. Secure the scene and immediately notify a supervisor and the appropriate investigative unit to handle the evidence collection. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, officer regarding the proper handling of evidence in a potential felony case. The officer must balance the immediate need to secure evidence with the procedural requirements for its collection and preservation to ensure its admissibility in court. Failure to adhere to established protocols can compromise the investigation, lead to the suppression of crucial evidence, and undermine public trust in the department's integrity. The officer's judgment is critical in determining the most appropriate course of action under pressure. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves securing the scene and immediately notifying a supervisor and the appropriate investigative unit, e.g., detectives or crime scene technicians, to handle the evidence collection. This approach is correct because it aligns with the Fort Worth Police Department's Standard Operating Procedures, SOP, concerning evidence handling, which emphasize the importance of trained personnel collecting and documenting evidence to maintain its chain of custody and integrity. This ensures that the evidence is processed according to established forensic standards, minimizing the risk of contamination or improper collection, and maximizing its evidentiary value in any subsequent legal proceedings. This also adheres to the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure regarding the preservation of evidence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves the officer collecting the suspected contraband themselves and placing it in their patrol car's evidence locker without further consultation or specialized assistance. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the established protocols for handling potentially critical evidence in a felony investigation. It increases the risk of contamination, improper documentation, and a break in the chain of custody, which could render the evidence inadmissible in court. This action deviates from the FWPD SOPs and the Texas Code of Criminal Procedures' implicit requirements for proper evidence management. Another incorrect approach is to leave the evidence unsecured at the scene while the officer continues their patrol duties. This is professionally unacceptable as it creates a high risk of the evidence being lost, tampered with, or destroyed, thereby jeopardizing the investigation. It demonstrates a failure to prioritize the preservation of critical evidence and a disregard for the potential impact on the case. A third incorrect approach is to dispose of the suspected contraband immediately, believing it to be minor. This is professionally unacceptable because it constitutes the destruction of potential evidence without proper authorization or documentation. Even if the item appears minor, its evidentiary value must be assessed by trained investigators and processed according to departmental policy. This action directly violates the principles of evidence preservation and could lead to severe disciplinary action and legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in law enforcement must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to departmental policies, state laws, and ethical considerations. When encountering potential evidence, the primary step should be to secure the scene, assess the situation, and then follow established protocols for evidence collection and preservation. This often involves notifying supervisors and specialized units. If unsure, seeking guidance from a supervisor or consulting departmental SOPs is paramount. The decision-making process should always aim to maintain the integrity of the investigation and ensure that all actions are legally sound and ethically defensible. Question 17. System analysis indicates that a Fort Worth Police Department officer receives a non-emergency dispatch call regarding a neighbor reporting unusual, loud noises emanating from a residence at 2 a.m. The reporting party states they have not seen the resident for a few days and are concerned. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the officer upon arrival at the scene? Option A. Immediately force entry into the residence to check on the resident's welfare due to the unusual noises and the reporting party's concern. Option B. Leave the scene without further investigation, as the call was non-emergency and the noises may have stopped. Option C. Cautiously approach the residence. Observe for any immediate signs of danger or distress. Attempt to make contact with the resident by knocking and announcing their presence. And if no immediate threat is apparent, explain the reason for their presence and attempt to resolve the situation through communication and appropriate referrals. Option D. Engage in aggressive questioning and demand entry into the residence from the reporting party to ascertain the nature of the noises. The correct answer is C. Cautiously approach the residence. Observe for any immediate signs of danger or distress. Attempt to make contact with the resident by knocking and announcing their presence. And if no immediate threat is apparent, explain the reason for their presence and attempt to resolve the situation through communication and appropriate referrals. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Fort Worth Police Department officers, balancing the need for swift action in a potential emergency with the requirement to adhere to established departmental policies and legal protocols. The officer must quickly assess the situation, determine the appropriate level of response, and act within the bounds of their authority and the law, all while considering the potential consequences of their actions. The urgency of the situation, coupled with the potential for misinterpretation or overreach, makes careful judgment paramount. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a measured approach that prioritizes de-escalation and information gathering before resorting to more forceful measures. This approach involves approaching the residents cautiously, observing for any immediate signs of danger or distress, and attempting to make contact with the resident through non-intrusive means, such as knocking and announcing their presence. If no immediate threat is apparent and the resident cooperates, the officer should then explain the reason for their presence and attempt to resolve the situation through communication, and if necessary, referral to appropriate social services or mental health professionals, in accordance with Fort Worth Police Department General Orders regarding welfare checks and mental health crisis intervention. This aligns with the department's commitment to community policing and the ethical obligation to protect citizens while respecting their rights. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately forcing entry into the residence based solely on a neighbor's report of unusual noise, without further observation or attempt at communication. This fails to adhere to the principle of probable cause for a search or entry, and could lead to a violation of the resident's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, as well as departmental policy on welfare checks. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the neighbor's concerns entirely and leave the scene without any investigation. This neglects the officer's duty to respond to potential calls for service and could result in a missed opportunity to assist someone in genuine distress or prevent a crime. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to uphold the public trust. A third incorrect approach is to engage in aggressive questioning and intimidation of the resident upon initial contact, even if no immediate threat is evident. This can escalate a potentially benign situation into a confrontation, erode community trust, and may violate departmental guidelines on professional conduct and de-escalation techniques. Professional reasoning. Officers should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough assessment of the information received. This includes considering the source of the information, the nature of the reported incident, and any corroborating evidence. Upon arrival, observation and cautious approach are critical. The next step is to attempt non-confrontational communication. If a situation requires intervention, officers must act within their legal authority and departmental policy, prioritizing de-escalation and the least intrusive means necessary to resolve the situation safely and effectively. Documentation of all actions taken is also a crucial component of professional conduct. Question 18. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, officer responding to a domestic disturbance call encounters a situation where one party, visibly agitated but not physically injured, claims the other party threatened them with a firearm that is no longer present. What is the most appropriate course of action for the officer to take? Option A. Immediately arrest the party accused of making the threat based solely on the verbal accusation, as the presence of a firearm, even if no longer present, constitutes a serious threat. Option B. Conduct a full, warrantless search of the entire residence to locate the alleged firearm, as the accusation alone provides sufficient justification for a comprehensive search. Option C. Prioritize immediate safety by separating the parties, conducting individual interviews, and lawfully searching for the alleged firearm before determining further action based on gathered evidence and probable cause. Option D. Leave the scene without intervention, as the absence of the firearm negates the immediate threat, and the officer cannot proceed without physical evidence. Correct answer is C. Prioritize immediate safety by separating the parties, conducting individual interviews, and lawfully searching for the alleged firearm before determining further action based on gathered evidence and probable cause. Explanation. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, officer responding to a domestic disturbance call encounters a situation where one party, visibly agitated but not physically injured, claims the other party threatened them with a firearm that is no longer present. The officer must make an immediate decision regarding the safety of all involved and potential evidence preservation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the officer to act decisively with incomplete information, balancing the immediate need for safety against the complexities of establishing probable cause for arrest or seizure of evidence. The absence of the alleged weapon significantly complicates the assessment of the immediate threat and the legal basis for intervention. The best professional approach involves prioritizing the immediate safety of all individuals present. This means conducting a thorough, yet swift, assessment of the scene for any ongoing threats, separating the parties involved to de-escalate the situation, and interviewing each party individually to gather their accounts. The officer should then conduct a lawful search of the premises for the alleged firearm, based on consent, exigent circumstances, or probable cause developed through the interviews and observations. If the firearm is located, it should be secured as evidence. If no firearm is found, the officer must still document the allegations and the investigation thoroughly, and take appropriate action based on the totality of the circumstances, which may include arrest for assault if probable cause exists for that offense, or providing resources and information to the victim. This approach aligns with FWPD policy and Texas law, which emphasize officer safety, victim protection, and the lawful collection of evidence. An incorrect approach would be to immediately arrest one party based solely on the uncorroborated verbal accusation without further investigation or attempting to locate the alleged weapon. This fails to establish probable cause for an arrest and could lead to an unlawful detention or arrest, violating the individual's rights and potentially exposing the department to civil liability. Another incorrect approach would be to leave the scene without any intervention, assuming no immediate threat exists because the firearm is not present. This neglects the officer's duty to investigate potential criminal activity and ensure the safety of the alleged victim, potentially leaving them vulnerable to further harm. A further incorrect approach would be to conduct a warrantless search of the entire residence without any legal justification beyond the initial accusation. This would violate Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, rendering any evidence found inadmissible and potentially leading to disciplinary action against the officer. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with immediate safety assessment, followed by de-escalation, information gathering through interviews, and then lawful investigative steps to establish probable cause for any subsequent actions, always adhering to departmental policy and legal statutes. Question 19. System analysis indicates that a Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, officer observes an individual loitering in a dimly lit alleyway known for recent drug activity. The individual is wearing a bulky jacket on a warm evening and repeatedly glances towards a parked car. Based on these observations, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the officer to take to ensure public safety while respecting the individual's rights? Option A. Perform a full search of the individual's pockets and any bags they are carrying to find contraband or evidence. Option B. Continue to observe the individual from a safe distance without any direct engagement until more definitive evidence of wrongdoing is apparent. Option C. Immediately detain the individual and demand to see their identification without any further articulable suspicion of criminal activity. Option D. Conduct a brief, non-intrusive pat-down of the individual's outer clothing for weapons, if reasonable suspicion exists that the individual is armed and dangerous. The correct answer is D. Conduct a brief, non-intrusive pat-down of the individual's outer clothing for weapons if reasonable suspicion exists that the individual is armed and dangerous. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, officers, balancing the need for swift action in a potential emergency with the constitutional rights of individuals. The officer must make a rapid judgment call based on limited information, where a wrong decision could lead to either a missed opportunity to prevent harm or an unjustified infringement of civil liberties. The professionalism required lies in the officer's ability to apply legal standards and departmental policy under pressure. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the officer conducting a brief, non-intrusive pat-down for weapons if they have a reasonable suspicion that the individual is armed and dangerous. This approach is grounded in the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court in Terry v. Ohio. Reasonable suspicion is a lower standard than probable cause, requiring specific and articulable facts that, taken together with rational inferences, reasonably warrant the intrusion. For the FWPD, this aligns with established training on lawful stops and frisks, emphasizing the preservation of officer and public safety while respecting individual rights. The pat-down is limited in scope to searching for weapons, not general evidence. Incorrect approach is analysis. Conducting a full search of the individual's pockets and belongings without probable cause or a warrant is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. This exceeds the scope of a lawful Terry stop and frisk and would likely be deemed an unlawful search and seizure, potentially leading to the suppression of any evidence found and disciplinary action against the officer. Ignoring the individual's suspicious behavior and continuing to observe from a distance without any further action, even if the behavior continues, could be professionally negligent if the officer's reasonable suspicion solidifies into a belief that a crime is imminent or has occurred. While caution is necessary, a complete lack of engagement when reasonable suspicion exists may fail to uphold the department's duty to protect the public. Immediately detaining the individual and demanding to see identification without any articulable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime is also a violation of constitutional rights. While officers can ask for identification under certain circumstances, demand for it without reasonable suspicion can constitute an unlawful seizure. Professional reasoning. Officers should employ a tiered approach to encounters. First, they must assess the situation for any indicators of criminal activity or danger. If reasonable suspicion of criminal activity exists, they may briefly detain the individual to investigate. If during this lawful detention, reasonable suspicion arises that the individual is armed and dangerous, a limited pat-down for weapons is permissible. This framework prioritizes constitutional rights while enabling officers to effectively and safely perform their duties. Question 20. Strategic planning requires the Fort Worth Police Department, FWPD, to accurately forecast its fuel needs for patrol vehicles for the upcoming fiscal year. Last year, the FWPD used an average of 150 gallons of fuel per day for its patrol fleet, and the fiscal year had 365 days. For the upcoming year, the department anticipates a 10% increase in total patrol hours, which translates to an estimated increase in daily fuel consumption by 15 gallons per day. If the cost of fuel is projected to be $3.50 per gallon, what is the total estimated fuel cost for the upcoming fiscal year, assuming the same number of patrol days? Option A, $195,000. Option B, $200,375,000. Option C, $190,000. Option D, $205,125,000. correct answer is B. $200, 375, 00. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in law enforcement budgeting and resource allocation. Officers are tasked with estimating future needs based on historical data and projected changes, requiring a balance between fiscal responsibility and operational readiness. The challenge lies in accurately forecasting demand for essential resources like fuel, which directly impacts patrol capabilities and response times within the Fort Worth Police Department's jurisdiction. Failure to accurately budget can lead to shortages, affecting officer safety and public service, or to wasteful overspending. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a detailed, data-driven calculation that accounts for both historical usage and anticipated operational changes. This method directly addresses the need for accuracy and efficiency in resource management, aligning with the Fort Worth Police Department's commitment to responsible stewardship of public funds and effective service delivery. By calculating the average daily fuel consumption and then projecting it over the anticipated increase in patrol hours, this approach ensures that the budget request is grounded in realistic operational demands. The formula used: \text total fuel needed equals \text average daily fuel consumption times \text number of patrol days plus \text additional fuel for increased hours where \text additional fuel for increased hours equals \text average daily fuel consumption times frac \text increased patrol hours 24 \text hours /day provides a precise and justifiable figure. This aligns with principles of sound financial management and operational planning expected of municipal departments. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves simply increasing the previous year's budget by a fixed percentage without considering specific operational changes. This method is flawed because it fails to account for the actual projected increase in patrol hours and the specific fuel consumption rate. It is an arbitrary adjustment that could lead to either an insufficient budget or unnecessary surplus. Another incorrect approach is to base the budget solely on the projected increase in patrol hours, without considering the historical average daily fuel consumption. This overlooks the baseline operational needs and could result in an inaccurate estimate that doesn't reflect the department's actual fuel requirements. A third incorrect approach is to request a budget based on a general estimate of fuel costs per vehicle, without factoring in the total number of patrol hours or the specific fuel efficiency of the fleet. This lacks the necessary detail and precision for a justifiable budget request, and could be easily challenged during the budgetary review process. Professional reasoning. Professionals in law enforcement budgeting must employ a systematic and analytical approach. This involves understanding historical data, identifying all relevant variables that will impact future needs, and applying appropriate mathematical formulas to derive accurate projections. The process should be transparent and defensible, ensuring that resources are allocated effectively to meet operational demands while adhering to fiscal constraints. When faced with resource estimation, professionals should always prioritize data-driven calculations over arbitrary adjustments or vague estimations.